Right, welcome back, UK Pro Muscle Podcast. Today we have a very special guest, Mr. Joe Jeffery, the man himself. Joe has been an educator for a long time. It's someone that I have followed personally for a long time, and definitely is a person that I always reach out to whenever I do have answers to get questions, especially when it comes to the juicy topic, the ped use and all the other things that come with it. Joe is definitely very well known and very well respected in the industry when it comes to this topic and when it comes to coaching in general, as he is one of the best in the industry. And obviously my friends and my circle do hold him at high regard, especially after seeing the good response that we've got with John and Luke off the last podcast. I definitely feel like we should bring Joe on to cover some topics today, which will be very interesting for a lot of you listeners looking to maximize your potential. So today's topic is basically going to be, how to get huge and how to unlock your potential as a professional. And when you are looking to truly maximize every single variable of your progress, and more importantly, come out of the other side still alive and still well, which is, again, the most important thing. We all love this game. We all love bodybuilding. We all want to make as much progress as we can. But again, what we stand for now and what Joe stands for is being able to do so and staying alive, more importantly. So I think today's conversation is going to be the one to hear. And like I said, Joe definitely has some very interesting topics. He's someone that I always reach out to, and he's someone I will be regularly consulting with throughout this off season, as I have in past as well. As again, what he brings to the table is very much invaluable. And I definitely think it doesn't get enough credit for what he does. And you would be surprised, guys, the amount of people that actually ride off Joe's knowledge and ride off the back of him and ride off the back of what he actually does for them without giving him any credit. And, I'm not one of them individuals. I'm very confident at what I do. And I'm not insecure in what I do and how I roll. So, I will be the one that always gives credit where it's due, whoever I consult with, whoever I get help from, because again, the whole name of the game is to be able to progress, keep an open mind. And that means being able to consult with people like Joe, like John, like Luke, and have these people in my corner for me to be a better athlete, a better coach, and make as much progress as I possibly can. I definitely feel like that setup is definitely the very best. So great introduction for Joe. And I will let Joe begin with this. And get you in on all the secrets, guys, on how to get huge and maximize your potential. Joe, your turn, brother.
Bro, you've absolutely blown my head off on that one. I'm going to leave this podcast thinking I'm something incredible. But thank you, mate. I do appreciate that. For anybody that doesn't know me, my name is Joe Jeffery. I've been an online physique coach for many years. I'm the founder of the coaching / posing / education portal team, Physique Collective. You've probably, if anybody frequents shows, you'll have seen us there with the Physique Collective t-shirts on. We always come in a bit of a posse with all the t-shirts on, almost like a uniform. But what we're going to discuss today is a topic I feel is pretty important to be covered, because there's a lot of PED-based information and education on safer use, which is, I think, a brilliant piece of terminology. I'm not demonizing that at all. Like, we would always want to do things as safely as possible, and also understanding that there is no safe methodology. So the longevity crowd and the sort of HRT plus crowd, or whatever you want to call it, there's a lot of great data there. And on the other side of things, there's a lot of great educational pieces and a lot of great anecdotal data on what Cuba does and is chasing, and what many people listening to this podcast will be chasing, which is essentially higher risk models centered around maximum protein accretion or maximum lipolysis, i.e. maximum muscle gain and maximum fat loss. And there doesn't seem to be a great amount of data on either somewhere in between, or more importantly, the topic of this podcast, how do we get as far over to the side of the higher risk models whilst controlling risk as much as possible, which is a little bit of a contraindication in many ways, or a juxtaposition would probably be a better terminology to use. Is like, how do we have high risk with less risk is essentially what we're talking about, because a key point with any PED use, with any metabolic pathway in general to understand is that more definitely does more to a point, and we're going to discuss that. But more also definitely hurts more. So I think a discussion on a needs analysis and a needs basis of the individual, and then how can we construct those needs and deploy a certain range of pharmaceutical interventions in there with the minimal risk possible with a polypharmacy model is the best sort of case route that we'll take here. So maybe I can give you guys a bit of a data-based things to think about, and also some anecdotal-based things to think about as well, because I am somebody that coaches and consults with professionals working at high levels as well, which I think is another rarer thing to hear discussed in the PD-centric world, other than coaches that like, this is kind of just what I do, and this is the model, and this is how it's always been, and I can't really put much of a data-driven, evidence-based answer on why that would be, you know? So therefore, I can't really give a database driven answer on why less might be better or more or something, because there's just no input, you know, on that one.
Love it. Love it. I think this is definitely going to get a lot of people intrigued. And I think the main objective here, most of all, is to try and keep people safer, because we will never be able to stop people abusing the practice, but we will always be able to preach on what you can do to be better, stay healthier, and stay alive. And I think this is exactly the reason why I want to do this with Joe, John, and Luke, because I think all four of us stand for exactly that. And obviously, off the back of this podcast, we will be doing another roundtable with Joe included, as he did actually miss the last one out of his own wrong timing. But this topic, I definitely think that we needed to cover with Joe himself, as that's something that, you know, we are both very passionate about, and Joe definitely wanted to share with you all. So I've actually been very excited for this. I almost did this on my show day. I was that excited for this. So I did actually message Joe, and I was like, but you know what? On that day, I ended up just chilling out. So
I knew that would happen, bro. So don't worry. I was trained. I said, I bet Cuba's changed his mind on that, and he just wants to chill out. So I'm going to leave him alone.
Yeah, you know what though? Like today, I can give a lot more energy. You know, on that day, I was kind of more focused, but I'm genuinely buzzing for this. So I was like, right, do you know what, Joe? I'm free of show day. Let's do it then. But you know, today's a good day as well.
Yeah, I think a cool way for us to go through this, you've just given me this idea when we were just talking before recording.
Yeah.
Would to give the listeners something to go away with, potentially we can have a discussion on what we would go through when it comes to stack design for an off-season setting. You know, like how do I piece this together?
Yeah. And I actually said this to Joe before the call. Obviously, I am at the moment I'm going through a recovery phase, so I will actually get Joe to do a mock stack design for myself. For my off season, because like I said, so far from every conversation that I had with Joe, it all definitely makes a lot of sense as to the approach we do take, and I definitely would like to try that for myself. So I think Joe knows exactly my goals. He knows my needs analysis. So off the back of that, Joe will be able to design a stack moving forward as to what I'm going to do and how I'm going to do it. But not only that, you know, I speak to Joe on a regular basis, so I can keep him in loop where I'm at with my diet and where I'm at with my training. Obviously, working with Luke now with my training as well from No Switch. I think that will definitely be useful data for Joe as well, to be able to kind of put together a mock stack design and moving forward. So it's definitely going to be exciting, because I'm determined to show people, how much progress you can make doing it the right way and doing it this way. It's something me and John has spoke about. And I can definitely probably shock a few people as to what can be done doing it through this approach. And I think, do you know what, Joe? If that can happen, I think if I can do it and prove to people that it can be done, I think that's going to open up a lot of minds and open up a lot of eyes.
Yeah,
as long as people actually believe me.
Yeah, well, that's a big problem, isn't it?
Yeah.
You've just touched on 2 points that I think are worth discussing before anybody even considers putting together their drug stack designs. Firstly, biological into individuality. So we've established previously when discussing things together that when you get to about that 15 milligram per kilogram per week point, you start to hit that kind of inverted U of fatigue, you know, your motivation to train dropping down, sleep's not so good, maybe that like sympathetic tone, or i.e. kind of nervous system stress response that androgens do drive, begins to tick up. So you can pretty clearly factor in that you're not going to be able to get higher than that. firstly, and that also you're not going to require that from day one. So that gives us a pretty clear like start and end point straight away. So we know that, okay, we're probably going to have to start at maybe just a bit above a physiological level or something to get some response, depending on how muscular you are. Like somebody like you, let's just say for argument's sake, okay, a 500 milligram per week total androgen load requirement. And maybe we're going to need to eventually get to, or we know that we top out at about 1500 milligram. We've got that 1000 milligram space in between. So talking about working with higher risk models, well, more does more. And we know that that's about the most that you can take. So that's as high as we're going to go, right? Yeah. And then the safer part becomes what is that 1500 milligram comprised of? What's our duration of exposure to it? And how long do we spend there and how do we get there, basically? So the second thing that you touched on was your training. So I think the biggest missed consideration with drug stack design in the enhanced realm is properly periodizing things and having a periodization plan. So let me give you an example of how that could look. You mentioned Christian, so let me give you Christian's. So Christian was post-show. Post-show, we needed to regain some fat and wash off some prep-mediated fatigue. So we take a needs analysis. What does he need to gain fat and rid fatigue? Well, you don't need any drug input for that, right? So like although just by virtue of washing off stress and progressively overloading from such a depleted state, yes, you can gain muscle, but the actual needs of the drug intervention are nil. So we stay at a complete baseline through that period. And then let's say we've got 6 weeks there and we were training with maintenance volume. So sensitivity to training volume is very, very good. Androgens have been low, so blood work's in a very good place. We're happy, healthy, ready to press on. So that's when we design the growth periodization plan, the macro cycle. For anybody that doesn't know what macro cycle means, it's just a sports science term that just means tethering together mesocycles. And one mesocycle is one training block. I see this language used quite frequently on like social media now, just as I think people just say these words without much understanding of what the considerations are. So let's say, so for Christians, for example, because here's another biologically individual thing. There's only so many accumulation blocks of training that you can get through before you need some time to rid fatigue again. In my experience, that's between 3 to 4 progressive blocks. So Christian's growth phase, we have 20 weeks, and within there's 4 training blocks with a 4-to-1 accumulation to deload paradigm. So he trains for 4 weeks, deloads for 1 week, 4 times. Now, needs analysis on drugs in there. We can discuss training another time, but he's doing chest and delt specialization, whatever. So the needs analysis of here is, right, the goal is protein accretion. The physique specific goal is protein accretion, i.e. what can we do to push up anabolism or turn down catabolism or push up anti-catabolism, right? So these are the consideration when it comes to drug deployment. And there's other things in there like insulin sensitivity and nutrient partition and whatnot, but I would categorize those as anabolic inputs if we don't want to be like there's a real scientific stickler for things like global anabolism and localized anabolism. And for the purposes of this podcast, forget that stuff. So we need anabolism, but how much anabolism and when? So me and Cuba were discussing this maxim of the stimulus threshold. So let's say in training, right, there's your maintenance volume for chest might be 5 sets a week. Okay, I'm just using random examples. Maybe the stimulus threshold that you need on week 1 to grow might be 8 sets. And then to drive a new and novel demand the next week, it might be 10. So you've got this J curve of requirements to anabolic inputs. So you have to factor that into your training firstly. You also have to factor that into your PD dose. So what do we need on week 1? Let's say we were at 300 milligrams. That's a pretty high cruise dose, but whatever. Let's say we're at 300 milligrams because we're discussing high risk models, you know, talking about someone like Cuba who probably does require that amount to maintain the amount of muscle that he carries. So what do we really need on week 1? Well, we've elucidated that maybe by weeks 14 to 20, we want to spend at our peak load of 1,500 milligrams. So we can say, maybe we're just going to go to 350 milligrams, 50 milligrams of additional androgens binding at the androgen receptor or binding at the estrogen receptor or binding at the glucocorticoid receptor, doing all the cool stuff that they do to turn on various pathways that are going to lend themselves to muscle growth. And that's good. That's all we needed that week to hit that stimulus threshold. So we've gained a lovely amount of muscle that week. We didn't need anymore. Now, if we'd have put 1,500 milligrams there, it would have worked. Probably not a hell of a lot more, but at some point you'd have been paying the cost for that. Health-wise, you're definitely paying the cost for that. That's something that never changes. More hurts more.
It's a big hit.
Yeah. Now, are we going to do that for 20 weeks? It will work, but it will work marginally better than the accumulation dose if you're looking in a vacuum of just what anabolics do. But when you look at the grand scheme of how the nervous system, specifically the autonomic nervous system, controls your rate of growth, I would hypothesize, got no clear data on this because we're not doing case studies on bodybuilders using anabolics. And believe me, no bodybuilders signing up for one either. Imagine a researcher says to you, you're right, for 16 weeks, I want you to do this. You would say, fuck off. Yeah, like, I'm not doing whatever you tell me to do. I want to do what I think I should be doing. So we've got this thing set in place here in motion. We know that androgens are maybe going to go 350, 400, 450, 500. Now we're working along that stimulus threshold. It's going up, up, up. It accumulates as needed. We spend time at peak load. Cool. That's maximizing our anabolic input. You can trend line that across any other metabolic pathway, like growth hormone. You know, there's a big fatigue element of growth hormone. Anyone that's taken high dose of growth hormone knows it can make you feel like the laziest man alive. You know, so maybe we're going to say, right, we only need 3 units here. Maybe for the second training cycle, we might use 4. Maybe for the third training cycle, we might use 5. But our total growth hormone exposure is more than sufficient to drive at least close to maximum anabolic output. But we don't pay the cost of the fatigue that then when we get to our third training cycle, we're lagging. We can't be bothered to do anything. Sleep shit. You know, all of this stuff.
I certainly think that there is a good point, Joe, that made here, because after my consult with Joe, I think it was 10 weeks out. 10 weeks out, I think it was 10 weeks out, 10 or 8 weeks out. 8 weeks out, yeah. I actually lowered my growth hormone dosage quite a lot, and I started to feel fresher and fresher. And by the time it hit 4 weeks out, I felt like I could literally go all year. But that's just a little reference point, guys. Like, Joe isn't really making it up. Like, this is real life shit because, again, I've experienced it. So, you know, a little bit of a backup here, just in case people are like, what? We're going to take less growth and we're going to feel better. What? Can't be real. Like, trust me. Yeah. Like, it is.
I think the key thing to understand is that inverted U relationship. Like, for not 1 second am I going to say that more drugs don't do more. Like, of course they do. But there's a physiological cost when more will really end up doing less as a result of what they do to your ability to basically run through hypertrophic pathways like training and stuff like this. Like, if the oxidative stress and, for lack of a better term, like the toxic load of your drug use becomes so high that like it's doing more and more, and then like your ability to drive adaptations is kind of crossing this precipice, and then you're coming off the edge of the cliff here and you're actually getting less, you know. And I've got some kind of hypotheses in my head around about where that happens for most individuals. I think this falls somewhere between 2.5 to 3 grams of total anabolics. And there's a great degree of biological individuality in any kind of pharmaceutical use. That basically means that everybody's very different. Like we've already said, Cuba, you top out about that 1,500. For some people, that's light work. I don't actually think that chasing to discover where that precipice point is very smart. Which is where I like models like the milligram per kilogram dosing schema. I know some people don't like this. Dr. Dean, if you're listening, I'm sorry, bro. He doesn't like this model. He recommends something actually that ties into it quite similar. I know that he says start at a dosage and titrate up for effect rather than use a milligram per kilogram. That definitely makes more sense. Like for your example, if we said we're going to get it to 20 milligram per kilogram, but your 1,500 milligram is correct, there we go. But I quite like it as to say, I'd never breach this point. Yeah. You know, as an example, certainly not bulletproof way of managing things. Like for a 100-kilo individual who's a client, I wouldn't ever breach 2,000 milligrams a week at peak load for a very short period of time.
Yeah. And that short period of time, would you consider that 4 to 6 weeks maximum?
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah. I generally like for ease, one training cycle. And I've never, ever, this might sound controversial, I never have a client train longer than 6 weeks before they get to the point of functional overreaching. And I think if you are accumulating for longer than 6 weeks, there's probably some element of chronic under training, like under stimulation there. And you could probably drive a greater level of demand for faster hypertrophy adaptations, you know?
Yeah.
So we've
definitely makes sense. After the 4 to 6 weeks, you would just simply go to maintenance after holding at the peak load.
Yes. Yeah, well, depends what's going to happen. Because if I've got 4 training blocks back to back, I'll just deload and go again, and we're still accumulating androgens. We're just fixing training mediated fatigue. But after this whole growth macro cycle, for most people, again, something that isn't commonly done, but I feel is integral, is maintain after your growth blocks. Very simple, just maintain. Don't go straight into some kind of deficit or something. There's non-acute hypertrophy adaptations, very clearly established in clinical practice, but bodybuilders are so growth-minded. I understand it. You get the itch to do the next thing. If you've just put on 30 pounds or something, there needs to be a period of you settling there.
Joe, I absolutely agree with that. I think the biggest mistake I made in past is definitely not doing a maintenance phase. And it's actually something me and Scott Stevenson, my last podcast, spoke about. You have to allow the muscle to settle before you do anything with it. Whether you want to go up or down, you have to let it hold. And I think there's a lot of merit to that. And I think that does take time. I feel like that kind of maintenance is a minimum of 6 weeks holding, where this makes so much sense for our listeners now, where when you hit that point, that 6 weeks maintenance is where you solidify and hold your position before you make that next step, which is definitely very, very, very smart.
Yeah. So again, drugs based on a needs analysis. What do we need to maintain? Well, it's going to depend on how big you are. You know, someone like you might need that 500 milligram androgen load total, maybe. I think most people can probably maintain on less than they think. Again, Dean, don't kill me, because I know that he's the TRT man. But look, we're talking about higher risk. Some people will require more. You simply take as many androgens as you need to maintain. If I was going to give a rough milligram per kilogram marker, 3 is going to be more than sufficient, 3 milligram per kilogram. If you're working with real high risk models and you can hold pretty good health markers, I think 5 milligram per kilogram can be okay there. Let's say 100 kilo male using 300 tests, 200 primobolan or something. Understand that that's definitely a high risk, but I much prefer to keep things within this kind of window, you know, like maybe higher on the maintenance, but lower on the blast, with accumulations between, as compared to right when we're in TRT here and they're like 5 grams for 16 weeks or something. You know, I don't think it's...
Do you know what, then it's okay because you're doing TRT for 6 weeks, so it's okay, you know.
Yeah, but then it's like, just got my blood work done at the end of this TRT phase and it's perfect. Yeah, of course it is. It's another thing, like with my clients, we get blood work done at the peak load. My rule is that we don't run the peak load if our acute health markers don't look perfect, you know. And that's something like we were just speaking about Joe Ballinger. Yeah. So, you know, at the end of a prep, peeled out your brain, running the highest dosages of drugs that he's going to run. We got him to go to the blood lab and his blood work was dead clean.
Yeah.
It can be done, which kind of lends us on to our next thing, which is compound selection within that total milligrams. So intelligent use of compounds that we have good predictable outcomes with and good human clinical data behind their use. So we know what they do and how they do it. And we've got good data over years of their use clinically to support those ideas. So I'm not a fan of the use of research chemicals and non-steroidal SARMs or veterinary drugs and things like this. I also kind of think, what is the point? And when you learn about the mechanisms of these drugs, you realize that there is no point really. So let's make anabolic use really clear right now, because it's confusing. You know, oh, do you use any EQ? That will do this to you, and this compound will do like you're in a sweet shop and everything like tastes different. Like, it's not the case. Over time, we started with the testosterone molecule, right? And over time, scientists have tried to divorce androgenicity and either just leave anabolism or increase anabolism. And this is actually the process of creating a steroidal SARM. And they've got better and better over time. We've eventually come to drugs like drostanolone, you know, Mastron and primobolan and anabar, and these things that work incredibly well in human clinical practice, and they're very much devoid of androgenicity. Trenbolone's on that list as a steroidal SARM that's very devoid from androgenicity as well. Another key here, don't get lost in rodent data. Actually in humans is very, very different. So we have this total androgen load. So let's say for you, this 1,500 milligrams that we're going to get to. Okay, now, like I said, let's make anabolic steroids very simple. They do things at the androgen receptor, or they can do things at the estrogen receptor, and they can do things at the glucocorticoid receptor. They do things at other receptors, like in terms of interactions with progesterone and prolactin and stuff like this. Not important to our discussion of physique development right now. So at the androgen receptor, they're going to bind and transcribe anabolic things like muscle protein synthesis and mTOR uptake and stuff like this, uptick in mTOR, sorry. Estrogen, some steroids are substrate for the aromatase enzyme, so they will aromatize into estradiol, or some anabolic steroids have interactions with the estrogen receptor itself, like anadrol and nandrolone. And of course, estrogen is extremely anabolic in many ways, such as its interactions with hepatic IGF-1 and therefore autocrine paracrine IGF-1, i.e. IGF-1 in the muscle cell. And then the interaction with the glucocorticoid receptor, a little bit more niche, so to speak, where some drugs shine, where they can basically inhibit cortisol from binding there and turning down muscle protein breakdown. So when I said in the beginning about anti-catabolic effects, this is what we're talking about, namely for our cohort. That's where trenbolone shines. So let's talk about a needs basis. Cuba's in off season. He's working up to 1,500 milligram. What of those pathways that steroids can work under make sense? So the androgen receptor, do we need to turn on anabolic stuff that leads to muscle protein synthesis? Yes. Cool. So drugs that do that are a candidate for us. That estrogen receptor, all of those good things it does with IGF-1, yes, we want that. The glucocorticoid receptor, turning down muscle protein breakdown. What muscle protein breakdown? We're in a growth phase, right? We're not, we don't need that. So forget about that category of drugs. So all steroids that we have do just about the same thing at the androgen receptor as one another. So basically all of them do that. And all of them do it to about the same degree. So cool. When people say like, this steroid's so much stronger than this one, like nandrolone's so much stronger than testosterone or whatever. It's just not true in humans. It's just not. It's never. If anybody can bring me the clinical data for that, I will change my mind 100%. As of right now, there's no data to support that, but there's plenty of data to support that they all do about the same thing. So anything works for that. So wouldn't it make sense that we would pick the one that carries the least side effects, that has the most human clinical efficacy, that is maybe the most tissue selective to muscle cell? Well, yeah, like why the hell would we use anything else when it's all doing it to about the same degree? So in my opinion, we look at what the most sort of recent, approved drug for human clinical practice that's been trialed at some pretty high dosages, for example, 1.2 grams in women and things like this, and that is primobolan. So this is the greatest growth anchor drug that we have available to us right now. That's it. When people say primo is weak, you have no idea what you're talking about. What you're actually saying is, I don't get a load of side effects from this drug.
Yeah.
When it comes to protein accretion rates, it's very clear that primobolan is just as potent as testosterone, as nandrolone, as trenbolone, as whatever. When it comes to anabolism, remember we're just talking about the androgen receptor. Now, let's talk about estrogen. Testosterone is quite clearly the obvious candidate. Bioidentical hormone will maintain our genetically expressed androgen to estrogen ratio because we're all going to aromatize at a specific rate. And we essentially just want to get that to the point of tolerability. Because then what happens if you take a gram of test and you have estrogenic side effects, you now need to take an AI, which is horrible for your health and horrible for your insulin sensitivity and horrible when it comes to IGF-1, just to pull it down to the amount that like you would get from 500 milligram of test. And remember what we just said about the androgen receptor. Well, if it's all doing the same thing, why wouldn't you just use 500 test and 500 something else? There we go. So within that 1,500 milligram, you would take whatever amount of testosterone that you can handle as a genetically unique individual. For most people, 300 to 400 milligram. Cuba can do a bit more than that. You know, we know that already, so cool. Do a bit more than that. Works well. The rest, fill it with primobolan. Now, you could say, what about nandrolone here? You know, NPP, DECA, where does that fall in? Because people like this. Look, it's going to be just as anabolic. It has interactions with the estrogen receptor. Great. It is used in human clinical practice. My biggest concern here is what we don't know. When it comes to neurotoxicity, I think is my greatest concern with androgen use. And clearly synthetic progestins have a greater contribution to neurotoxic outcomes. So my general recommendation would be to tread with caution when it comes to trenbolone and nandrolone exposure, and only use them when absolutely needed. Don't think in a growth phase we can make a good enough argument that it is needed over the anabolism of primobolan and the estrogenic contribution of testosterone. In a harsh dieting phase, you can make a good argument that trenbolone, well, it's not needed because naturals get peeled. I don't want to get caught on that argument, but it's definitely providing a lot more than something else would be when it comes to attenuating muscle protein breakdown. So I would say use with caution. So none of my clients, including pros, were using more than 100 milligrams of trenbolone per week in any of their shows this year. So there we go. That's anabolics made simple. We've just gone through what they do and picked the best one most suited for the goal. It can be that simple.
I think that definitely has been made as simple as it possibly can for the listeners, and definitely a lot of things to highlight. Joe has mentioned, you know, the use of only, you know, the PEDs that have been tried and tested in clinical research and have been approved, which is something that many people overlook. And I definitely think that's a big, big mistake that I have made in past. And like I said, guys, the whole point of me doing this is to try and bring something to you that will avoid you all making the mistakes that I have made, which potentially will cost you a lot of progress and will have a harsher effect on your health. Because again, the reason why we do this is to try and keep people safe. So definitely some great points made by Joe here. And definitely all makes sense as well, which is the most important. Like I can't see anyone really being able to disagree with this or having any logical response towards this. And
that's just the anabolics as well. I mean, there are of course other metabolic pathways that we can stimulate, but that human clinical deployment one is a very obvious one to me. But we have this like emotional blindness in bodybuilding, emotional dissonance, you could say. Like a really easy example that I use often is with like a vaccine, like COVID vaccine. If I said like, right, so imagine the government go, right, guys, we've got this COVID vaccine, but a couple of studies on pigs, one study on rats, nothing on humans yet. We're going to roll it out. Who's taking it? No one, right? But when it comes to anabolics, got this DHB is super strong, blah, blah, blah. Got like a couple of studies on pigs. And bodybuilders like, yep, give me that because somebody said it was stronger. You know, for me, that's absolute lunacy.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense, to be honest. And I've, you know, it certainly doesn't make sense. I've tried I know a lot of people that have trialed it and the results they got were very, very weak and the blood work came back looking pretty terrible. So I think that says it all in itself.
The best you can hope for with drugs like DHB or MENT and stuff like that is it's probably going to be just as anabolic as everything else and potentially more problematic.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't bother. On that note of healthier choices, there are a couple of drugs worth mentioning that I believe every enhanced user should have in their stack design purely for negating some of the deleterious health effects of androgen use, although they do carry some a fairly high magnitude of positive outcomes. The first one would be an angiotensin receptor blocker, such as telmisartan. There's a lot of things that bodybuilders do that push up angiotensin too, and this is going to be the primary pathway by which ventricular hypertrophy is going to occur via the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. This is also a drug that you can use to modulate fluid retention pre-contest or in peak week without the use of an AI or a CERM. It's what I prefer to do. It's generally how I found to bring people in dry but not lose any of the glucose partitioning benefits of estrogen and things like this. Or like we were just talking about growth hormone, like the way that growth hormone pushes up extracellular fluid retention is via aldosterone, and telmisartan will definitely pull that down, but then you'll keep all of the cool sort of pop that growth hormone gives you, whilst pulling off that extracellular wall. But that's one that I would definitely include, telmisartan being my personal favorite, but you know, there is candesartan or losartan, all doing pretty similar things when it comes to angiotensin 2 suppression. But there's some other benefits of telmisartan, such as potential myostatin inhibition and PPAR modulation, which is a very interesting pathway that can like increase fat oxidation and glucose disposal. And the thing is, when you start to stack these things on top of each other in clinical dosages, you get a pretty potent effect. Although if you look at each one in isolation, it does very little. You know, like people with high blood pressure taking telmisartan aren't walking around at 300 pounds lean, but you extrapolate the rest of what we do with that tiny little input, it's positive. Metformin is another one, as a very potent antioxidant. Oxidative stress is a huge concern, which must be reflected in our nutritional practices and whatnot, and our stress and sleep management. Also for insulin sensitivity purposes, metformin is an excellent drug, and also for its effects on gut microbial health. And its longevity outcomes are very positive. So they're two that I would put with any androgen user. I think our podcast that we did with Professor Scott Howes a while ago, he did put that out there, and that was a big sigh of relief for me. I've been saying that for a long while, and I've had a bit of shit for saying, why are you getting drug users to take more drugs? It's kind of what we do, isn't it? But
to be fair, metformin's the least of the worries.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. Metformin and telmisartan are one that I would just have in for anybody using PEDs. But I suppose that brings us on to so we've got anabolics covered. But essentially, we've just got insulin and growth hormone as our main sort of growth agents left, and I feel like these have some pretty steep inverted use. Like they're both very much double-edged swords with some incredible synergies with one another. You've seen this firsthand with the growth hormone. If you find a dose that allows you to reap the synergies with, in fact, I use the word synergies. I think this is important when it comes to drug stack design, like not just revving any pathway super hard and leaving the others just to kind of sit dormant. You know that old thing that you see on the forums, like, don't even think about growth hormone until you're doing like a gram of gear or something, which is just total nonsense. Like, if you want to get away with using less gear, but driving the same, if not more, anabolism for less total milligrams of androgen exposure, you should use as many pathways as possible, as many as possible. So intelligent growth hormone deployment will let you use less anabolics for less acute deleterious health effects for more anabolism. So factoring in your growth hormone dose within that risk to reward is, up to you, but I don't tend to ever breach 6 units with a client per day. And that would always be microdosed. So there's some data to support systemic IGF-1 or endocrine IGF-1 to be a negative feedback regulator of local IGF-1. The only IGF-1 that has some good data to support being quote unquote anabolic is IGF-1 in the muscle cell, localized, autocrine, paracrine, makes sense. We want to maximize that as much as possible. So I would use your growth hormone in maybe 3 units maximum dosing. I really don't like this like every other day 10 unit protocol or whatever that thing is. I don't think that makes much sense on an objective database scale. And I would also keep it away from your insulin use ideally. because there's some pathways that they both share that directly antagonize one another, like the ERK, MEK pathways. Don't need to know what that means, but I think a pretty easy sort of strategy to use would be just growth hormone in the morning, give it some time to mobilize fatty acids, and then insulin around your workout window is a pretty good one. But yeah, once you get over that 6 units, I find that systemic IGF-1 is a little bit too high, the fatigue driver's a bit too aggressive, the insulin resistance issues are a bit too high, even though I know that we're talking about adipocyte insulin resistance. But yeah, I don't see there. So that's quite a narrow sort of inverted U, like from 1.5 units up to 6, and then that's basically as far as I would go with a client. But you can map that into that accumulation, you know. So okay, this last mesocycle I'm going to have at 6 units, and maybe I'm going to go 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 3, 4, 5, 6, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, so 4 training cycles, 3, 4, 5, 6. There you go.
Easy.
Yeah, if it works like that, it's got to be right. Now, insulin, I'm aware that we're coming up on time, so I'm trying to cram this in, but we can do an additional. I mean, I've got a podcast with Muscle Mentors, like 90 minutes long, and it's just on growth hormone, so you can long that out.
Yeah, don't worry, I'm sure people are keen.
Insulin as a health deployment is something that I want to talk about here. With George Peterson's death, sorry, I'm waiting for my training partner. I'm just making sure he doesn't walk up the drive, knock on the door, and the dog's going mental because it'll break everyone's ears. So with George Peterson's death, I looked at the comments on some of the posts, and I see insulin use needs to leave bodybuilders. Someone's like, what is going on here? So firstly, insulin's actually a pretty safe deployment for people that aren't insulin dependent diabetics. For example, the LD50 of Lantus, and for anybody that doesn't know, LD50 means lethal dose 50. So the dose of a drug that would kill about 50% of the population. The LD50 of Lantus insulin is 1,000 units, and they come in 300 unit pens. So you'd have to somehow pin more than 3 pens for there to be about a 50% chance that it would kill you. Now, the effective dose is like 10 to 20 units per day. So unless somehow you take not 10 times, but 100 times the dose you're supposed to take, you're going to be all right. Now, as a health deployment, I like basal insulins like Lantus. Bodybuilders do essentially what obese individuals with metabolic diseases do, which is overeat primarily carbohydrates and push their pancreas very hard. And they end up with insulin resistance issues and what else, you know, all kinds of issues with their overeating over time. So using a Lantus insulin to sit in the background and pull the stress off of the pancreas and give the beta cells a little rest is something that I like to do with bodybuilders, and 10 to 20 units is fine. Maybe that 0.1 units per kilogram of body weight works fine. 20 units is the top end, just to take some stress off the pancreas. Now, insulin is not one that I like to use too aggressively to drive that kind of hyper nutrient partitioning vector. Again, a pretty narrow inverted U, I find, just due to the acute insulin exposure, the hyperinsulinemia, and therefore the insulin resistance. So you're talking about shortening your growth phase for almost like this really short period of massive nutrient partitioning. You know, so even just 5 units of a rapid acting insulin pre-workout, that's I'm happy with what that does to drive super physiological glycogen partitioning without ruining your insulin sensitivity.
I think the biggest point that needs to be mentioned here is people just simply abuse it, and it doesn't have any benefits whatsoever, in my opinion. You know, there does come a risk with it as well.
Yeah.
I think people just absolutely overuse it, and unless you know exactly what you're doing, you shouldn't even consider it, in my opinion.
Yeah. And we've all seen what happens with individuals that do the crazy, like Milos protocol, for example. It's a very big kind of blow up to then a very big deflation. With, again, it's a massive fatigue driver, like every drug you see, all of these inputs you have driving that little bit of nervous system fatigue. When paired up together, they result in a short growth phase. And the most important thing when it comes to protein accretion is time. So how long can you actually drive anabolism? Like how long can you just tip that muscle protein synthesis up a bit or push that muscle protein breakdown down a bit and then ride that wave for as long as possible? Because having that huge anabolism for like 4 weeks is not enough when you're at Cuba's level. You know, you need time, you know, to drive that outcome. It's super important. And there we go. I pretty much just put a drug stack together. So get your total milligrams, test some primo on the anabolics, telmisartan, metformin, 10 to 20 units of Lantus with 5 units of some kind of rapid acting insulin analog peri-workout, and you're all good.
I think the big takeaway point from this podcast as well, guys, if you are doing something daft or if someone is advising you to run something that exceeds anything that has been mentioned here or is based around the PEDs that haven't been mentioned and the PEDs that are, you know, only for experimental use, so to speak, or veterinary use, you may want to reconsider your course of action and you may want to reconsider another way because, again, there is probably a better way. There is probably a healthier way and, more importantly, more effective way, which will save you a lot of health issues and implications moving forward and long-term implications as well, which is the big thing here. So, you know, there are better ways and there are smarter ways. There are healthier and safer ways while still being able to get the maximum outcome. And I think that's definitely the biggest takeaway point that listeners want to kind of consider moving forward from here. By any means, you know, we don't condone or promote any use whatsoever. But if we can save someone or help someone see a better way and a safer way, we will absolutely do so.
Yeah, absolutely, man. So we can get a consultation in and I'll get to work on getting your off-season PED stack design together.
That's it. Absolutely. Guys, anything else you want to add, Joe?
No, just thank you everybody for listening and I hope that it has been useful. It's worth just reminding everybody that this is a very brief snapshot on a huge topic. I'm going to do some self-promotion here. Absolutely. I have the Physique Collective app. And the reason why I've made this app is for people to get really easy access information that is easy to understand, not full of scientific jargon, and very easily applicable to your outcomes. So I've never made a penny off of Physique Collective, so I'm going to promote it pretty hard. So on the app, you can go on there and I've got videos on everything. Lots of different Trenbolone videos, Primo Bolin videos, growth hormone videos, insulin videos, periodizing this, planning that, prep strategies for PED stack design, all of this, all on the app. So if you go on the App Store, search Physique Collective, it's only $6.99 a month. Sign up for 1 month, watch everything and cancel it if you want. I'm quite emotionally just attached to people getting the information out there. So if you want a bit of a broader view on some of the topics in here, then that's all in there for you guys.
That's it, Joe. If you want to find Joe as well, it's Joe at Physique Collective on Instagram as well. So anyone wants to reach out to Joe, he will be there. Guys, thank you so much for tuning in. That will conclude today's series of Safer Use. We will have part 2 coming with Mr. John Jewett, Luke Miller, and Joe himself once John has recovered from Olympia. So we will probably get that recorded sometime next week. Really appreciate you all listening. And I do hope someone has taken something away from this. And like I said, stay safe, guys, and always consider that there might be a better, healthier option, which will create a better outcome.